I am dating a psychoanalyst. So my girlfriend's a psychoanalyst, which is why I brought up Freud.
That's why you brought up Freud.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm now concerned after talking to you that I may become attracted to the idea of myself being a psychoanalyst.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right. Phil Illy is an autoheterosexual author who aims to mainstream autoheterosexuality and destigmatize it so that more of his kind can jettison shame and live in union with their inner cross-gender spirit. He is the author of the book, Autoheterosexual. Phil, welcome to the Diet Soap podcast on Sublation Media. We're a bunch of Marxists over here, so we try to be libertarian as well. So I'm very glad to get a chance to talk to you.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have your book, Autoheterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex, I think is the subtitle of that book. And I'm finding it very interesting. And I originally saw you or encountered your work on another podcast called Gender, A Wider Lens, which is a podcast which I think comes from a gender critical perspective. Although I wouldn't necessarily say that they are wanting to be exclusionary or turfy, but they are critical of what they're calling trans ideology over there. And so I was surprised by the way that encounter went. It wasn't horrible, but they were not as open as I was expecting.
Right. Do you know about the broader context where roughly a year ago there was a controversy because I attended their conference and it led to a big Twitter struggle session against them?
No, I didn't know that.
So that's why they were so oppositional to me, because they had to demonstrate to their audience, like, pushback to me. You know, we had already recorded an episode a year before, but they didn't want to air that one because they weren't tough enough on me, after the controversy. So they recorded a newer one where they were more aggressive.
So what was it about you that caused their audience to do a dogpile on them? What were they reacting to? That was what's so controversial about you?
It's not me. I didn't do anything. It's just autogynephilia, which, just for the audience, in case they don't know it, autogynephilia, it refers to an internalized sexual attraction of being a woman. There's good scientific evidence that it's the most common cause of male to female transgenderism and gender dysphoria in males. But their audience is very much hailing from the turfy rad femme sort of gender critical background, and that they've been exposed to a lot of anti-autogynephile propaganda, so to speak, where so they sort of have a hair trigger response to seeing an autogynephile. And the fact that I was being open about it at their conference, and that I dressed in, like I wore a dress, which I usually do, because I'm autogynephilic. It's better. Yeah. But it's just their audience's response to autogynephilia, basically.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about autogynephilia for a little while. I've encountered the term autogynephile or autogynephilia. I've known about it for a while because I'm on the left, pretty on kind of the radical left, and so defending and understanding transgender activism or ideology was something that I was required to do for,
Yeah.
like a decade or two now. And when I first encountered the term autogonophile, it was taboo. It was considered to be a slur or transphobic.
It's often used
Even
that way as a pejorative. Yeah.
yeah, and well, but I think as I looked into it more, I also encountered uh, Bailey's book,
Yeah.
and there was a book, I forget the woman's name, but it was called
Eh,
Galileo's Middle Finger.
right. That's Alice Dreger's book. Yeah.
Yeah, Alice Drager. Um, and she wrote about Michael Bailey, and
That's where I
uh,
first heard about it, actually, from her
yeah,
book.
yeah. And so Michael Bailey was canceled. He was attacked by trans women who found his book, The Man Who Would Be Queen. I think it was what the book is called, Michael Bailey's
Yeah,
book.
that's the title.
Yeah, offensive. They kind of started going after him due to the way he popularized Ray Blanchard's work, and so seemed to me that the idea of autogonophilia was verboten. It was taboo amongst the trans community, and I always thought the reason why was because of a kind of not a conservative that's just in the transgender community, but a conservatism that's in the transgender community, but a conservatism that is in our culture overall around sexuality. That by stripping sexuality out of the story of transgenderism, people felt that they were safer and would be more likely to win social acceptance. Does that
Yeah. Yeah, there's
make sense?
pragmatic reasons like that for it, that the transsexuals wanted to ensure that they wouldn't be discriminated against, and they wanted to be able to argue for inclusion in, say like the bathrooms of their choice, etc. And they were worried
Mhm.
about the optics of how the autogonophilia theory could impede their goals of their movement.
Right, but when I would interview trans women and talk to them with the recorder off, often they would tell me, yeah, there is some truth to autogonophilic theories and the theories of autogonophilia, and this is part of my own personal experience, but nonetheless, the right is going to obliterate us if we talk about this in public and so on. So I think it's important to at least explore the idea that it may be an explanation for the transgender phenomenon. No, there's two explanations according to Blanchard. Basically you're either homosexual or autogynephilic if you are
Yeah, those are
attracted to
the
being
two
trans.
types. Yeah.
Okay.
And demographically, the Blanchard's research showed that you could categorize trans women who were non-homosexual with respect to birth sex, which means heterosexual, bisexual, or asexual. You could categorize them as autogynephilic. And if you do that and you look at transgender surveys about the sexual orientations they report, you arrive at an estimate that at least 80% of trans women in the U.S. are of autogynephilic ideology. And that's just a lower bound. The real number is higher because there's going to be some that prefer men as sexual partners. And um, if I were to guess what the true percent is, it's probably within a few percent of 95% of trans women are of autogynephilic ideology, which might sound pretty audacious or pretty intense of a claim, but it's it just seems to be the case based on my observations.
Okay. Now you just said something that was counterintuitive to me. You said that um, some autogynephilic trans women would be attracted to men, which
Right.
which seem to push against the idea that they're autoheterosexuals. And
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. Um, and the reason this occurs is there's this, Blanchard called it pseudo-bisexuality, but people are moving away from using that terminology because it's kind of invalidating. And in these sort of spheres online, we use the term meta-attraction instead. Meta just refers to the self, like that's an attraction that references yourself. And basically, there's plenty of autogynephilic people who experience attraction to men that is not the conventional kind of attraction to men that you think of when you think of, say, like homosexual men.
Mm-hmm.
It's instead like a contextual, gender-affirming same-sex attraction, where the being in relation to a man helps them embody femininity, and so they're attracted to being with a man.
Okay. Maybe we should step back because I'm following you, but I want to give the audience a full picture of the ideas at work here.
Yeah.
The first thing I want to, I guess, ask you about is just the term auto in either autogynephilia or autoandrophilia or autoheterosexuality. What is that doing in the word, and what is the empirical phenomenon of that, and what causes it?
The auto is just the Greek root from autos for self. It's kind of like how a plane with autopilot can pilot itself, or an autobiography is written by the person that it's about.
Mm-hmm.
And the evidence for sort of broadly what I call autosexuality, this sort of like internalized form of sexual orientation, is Blanchard and other researchers like Bailey have shown that for, at least in males, because they haven't really researched females, which is a critique I have, but not to digress into that. In males, for every type of sexual attraction that a male can have, a subset of them will have an internalized form of that attraction and become attracted to being whatever it is they're attracted to. And this most commonly happens with respect to heterosexuality, resulting in autoheterosexuality, which in males would be autogynephilia. But it can also happen with attraction in other dimensions, such as age, species, race, or disability. There's forms of internalized attraction in all those other dimensions of attraction. And there's forms of trans identity corresponding to all of them. Like there's transabled people that feel that they should actually be disabled or be amputated. There's people that identify as children and like to role play as children. There's people that feel that they're trans race, that internally they might feel that they're one race, and it differs from their bodies, like phenotypic race. And also with trans species, there's people that have the internal feeling of being another species. Most commonly, it's a canine species. Second most common type is a feline type species, which roughly matches up with pet ownership trends. So I assume it's something to do with childhood exposure in terms of the specific type of animals they're into. But there's just this general principle that some proportion of people will have an internalized form of sexual orientation that makes them attracted to being a particular type of thing.
So this, again, just to repeat this, an auto-heterosexual, whether it's a man or a woman, will be sexually attracted to the idea of being the kind of person that they're sexually attracted to externally.
Yeah, it usually matches up with externally, like with sort of the exception that I gave earlier of the meta attraction that can make someone experience a gender affirming same-sex attraction, in which case it wouldn't exactly match up. But generally it does tend to match up, that people are attracted to being the type of thing that they're attracted to.
Right. So so in that loop-de-loop version, the meta autogynephilic, that's someone who starts out attracted in theory to women, and then they become attracted to the idea of being a woman, and then they, in order to really affirm that themselves being a woman, they'll start to date men externally.
Yes.
Right.
That's sort of the general pattern. And for most people who experience it, it's not to the degree that they would only be into men. It's usually just to the degree that they're bisexual.
Oh, I see. Okay. And okay, so now we kind of know what the technical definition is, but do you have an explanation for what produces this effect of wanting to be the kind of person that you are sexually attracted to, or the kind of dog that you are
Right.
sexually
Like, where
attracted
does
to?
that theorized cognitive mechanism comes from? The internalization, like, where does
Yeah.
that come from?
Yeah.
Blanchard theorized that there's some sort of mechanism with sexual orientation that biases your attraction outward versus inward. He called this erotic target location error, which is just that whatever mechanism biases your attraction inward versus outward, sometimes there's an error and it gets like rerouted inward rather than outward. Of course, neuroscience is still in too early of a stage to really be able to find the physical substrate of this mechanism in the brain. It's just a theorized thing at this point, but it does, as far as I can tell, it's the simplest, best explanation. It's basically the most parsimonious explanation for all those different types of trans identity I mentioned earlier, and also transgender identity.
So what we're really describing when we talk about autoheterosexuality or any kind of autosexuality is this internalization of your libidinal object and the desire to be what you're
Yes.
sexually attracted to. But whatever explanation we might have for the cause of that would hinge on what theory of mind we chose to be, that we thought was the most accurate. You could be a Freudian and have this notion of autogynephilia or autoheterosexuality help you. You would explain it differently than someone who is a cognitive behavioral type or has a different theory of mind, right?
I mean, yeah, I guess Freudians would explain things differently. The sort of discipline that the autogynephilia theory comes from, and the broader theory of erotic target identity inversion, is it comes out of sexology, which is the sexual research into the psychology of sexual orientation.
And does sexology have come out of another field of psychology, another school of psychology?
I would say it's just a subset of psychology more broadly.
Yeah. Right. So could you be a Freudian sexologist?
I don't.
Or a Jungian sexologist or any of these other
I
psychoanalytic
don't
types?
tend to see much overlap. I think it's because the Freudian and Jungian approaches are not as empirically based, I would say. Whereas there's quantitative evidence for the theory of erotic target identity inversion.
Right. Well, let's bracket that. I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole of trying to like what psychological theories require a theory of mind as opposed to just a empirical data set. Say, is a question that comes to mind, but I want to just put that aside but the point is that your theory here doesn't hinge on an explanation of some theory of mind necessarily. It is an explanation. It is actually descriptive of what has been found empirically to be the case.
Right. It's just trying to give a clear example of like, this is how reality seems to be. And it's sort of the simplest explanation for a wide variety of observations.
Right. And this is based on behavior and self-reporting of internal states, basically.
There was one study where autogynephilic arousal was objectively measured with penile plethysmography, which is they just basically measure your blood flow to your penis in that. But aside from that, it's pretty much just based on self-report, but what trans women and other gender nonconforming people say about their experiences and their feelings, and also based on observing behavior.
Did that study have anything to do with the study that showed that most women, that like heterosexual women are actually bi? Do you remember that study that I'm referring to?
Oh, are you talking about when they measured female arousal in the lab and the females had a gender non-specific response where they got similarly aroused to male content and female content and even like bonobo content as well?
Yeah, right. Yes, that's what,
Yeah.
that's what I
Right. My personal interpretation of like the female results in that is more that it's whatever they're measuring it's I don't think it's measuring genuine female arousal that well, because it just seems much more plausible to me that the measurement itself is imperfect,
Right.
rather than yeah.
Yeah, because their self-reporting would be one thing, and then their arousal pattern would be something altogether different. So it may be, but to push against your skepticism about the measure, they did find that gold star lesbians were aroused by female content and nothing, and not as much anything else. So
Right. So yeah, it's important there's been a few different studies on this sort of thing, and the general trend is that in exclusively androphilic females, which is attracted to men, that they tend to have a gender non-specific pattern of response where they respond similarly to different types of stimuli, whereas the sort of the gold star lesbians, as you put it, the very like for sure lesbians, very homosexual ones, they actually, as you said, did have a category specific pattern of responding where they responded more strongly to the female stimuli in the lab. And then the bisexuals had sort of an intermediate degree, in between those two. Ooh, I can't hear you. Is your mic working?
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, to get back to autoheterosexuality, the what you've done in your book, I mean, your book doesn't just lay out these terms. It has a variety of chapters and ideas in it, but what you're doing in the book is describing the transgender phenomenon in terms of sexual attraction, and you are speculating based on the data you have about to what degree the auto-heterosexual is to what degree transgender people are mostly auto-heterosexual, and in an attempt, as I read in your bio, to destigmatize auto-heterosexuality.
And just so that the people that experience it can not be confused. And so that just it's really confusing to be male and then really want to be female and not know why. It was confusing for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've gotten plenty of messages from people from other autogynephiles and autoandrophiles who found my book beneficial, and they're glad to finally have some concepts that can help them make sense of their experiences. And it seems really important, especially because medicalization is involved. I'm just really worried that because of how much the transgender movement pushed back on gatekeeping, that the only people who do gatekeeping anymore are trans people themselves. And so I want them to be armed with as much knowledge as possible so they can be sure they're making the right choice.
Right. Well, I want to change the topic away from autoheterosexuality a little bit, then in response to that, to the new studies that have come out and some new information has come out around medicalization. The CAS report, for instance, which seems to demonstrate that many of the medical treatments that are offered through what's called gender affirming care cannot be conclusively shown to have beneficial effects in terms of mental health.
Right. It neither
Uh, th-
proves nor disproves. It's just showing that the body of evidence is weak.
yeah, right. And um, a lot of it seems to me that as transgender people and activists have tried to justify gender affirming care and also just the practice of transition, that they have tended to rely upon an argument, at least quite often, that gender dysphoria is a mental illness that causes other kinds of illnesses like depression or anxiety or suicidality, and that therefore, because of the way in which it can manifest as suicidality in particular, it must be treated, and it must be treated through an affirmation and that includes medicalization, so hormonal treatments and surgery being the most extreme version of the affirmation. Do you think that understanding the transgender phenomenon in terms of sexual desire would mitigate against medical interventions a bit, that you would be, that someone who understood their feelings of wanting to be the other gender as stemming from their sexual desires would be less compelled to go down the route of the medicalized route and surgical transition or hormonal transition? Or
I I think that it'll really depend on the individual. I think overall, if this information were more widely known, that overall the trend would be that transition rates go down. But on an individual level, people respond to this knowledge differently. Some of them, they feel ashamed or they think that sexuality isn't a valid reason to transition. And they may decide not to transition because of that. Whereas others come to the conclusion that like, oh, this is coming from these gender feelings are coming from my sexuality. And I've always felt this way, and you can't change sexual orientation. So my feelings are unlikely to change. So therefore I should stop procrastinating on transition and get started. So there's different responses to this knowledge.
yeah. Um, uh, I want to ask you about attending the gender specs conference. That's where that controversy came?
Yeah, the Gen Spec conference in Denver
Gen
last
Specs.
year.
Yeah. So you were invited to that to speak? Is that right? Or how did that come
No,
about?
unfortunately, I was not invited to speak.
Uh,
And I was disappointed with how political the presentations were. Had much more of a political, religious, almost sort of vibe. And I kind of care about what's true because I care about the scientific matters. And no, I would have liked to speak, but I'm sure that it would have upset many people there because what I'm saying goes against the rapid onset gender dysphoria hypothesis that their audience is really enthralled with.
okay, that's something I want to talk to you about. To what extent could it be true both that that autogynephilia is the primary explanation for the transgender phenomenon experience, and also true that we're seeing an increase in transitioning due to something like social contagion? Are those things truly at odds with each other?
I don't
And
think
you're
they're mutually exclusive at all. I think what's happening is that the social environment has changed. It's sort of transgenderism has become kind of glamorized. Some teenagers who are just trying to find their identity. I'm sure there's some that decide that they feel weird or different because they're trans, but they're not actually trans. But I think overall what's happening is that people have this trait within them of internalized heterosexual attraction, and the things that they hear from the transgender movement are very just naturally appealing to them. Like the idea that you can change your gender, that sort of the blurring the boundaries between sexes, the idea that you can change sex, sort of the axiomatic beliefs that trans men are men, trans women are women, like those sort of foundational beliefs in the transgender ideology, so to speak, they're very appealing to someone that is internally attracted to being the other sex. It's telling them what they want to hear. And so I think they organically are drawn to it.
Yeah. Well, I a few years ago interviewed a trans woman who was also a communist, and the whole thing ended up being off the record. But the story that she told me was one where, well, what she said, what I remember her saying particularly was that there is a slur or saying on the right that goes like this, that the ultimate final destination for an incel is to become a trans woman. And then this trans woman told me that there was some truth to that, that as men have struggled to find partners and succeed, in the dating market, and if they've grown more isolated and are less and less likely to participate in the social world, maybe they're unemployed, maybe they're struggling in school, and they can't find a girlfriend, that this autoheterosexual option becomes more attractive, so that it could be a socially produced phenomenon, or at least partially produced by the social circumstances. What do you make of that theory?
There's a grain of truth to it, that because of our present material conditions of existing so much online in a disembodied format, I think it makes it, because identity is more malleable and not as tightly coupled to our physical bodies as it used to be. I think it's more people are drawn to transition, that it seems to offer more. But as for the specific incel to trans pipeline,
have you heard that before?
Yeah, and I think what's happening there is that basically people with autism spectrum, people on the spectrum, they have higher rates of internalized sexuality. And I don't think it's a coincidence, for example, that the word autism and autosexual start with the same Greek root for self.
Okay.
I think that what's happening is, this is just my hypothesis. There's not evidence yet for why trans people are so autistic. But I think what's happening is that as part of the broader internalization that sort of happens with autism, I think it's the people with that internalization are going to be more likely to have that internalization mechanism part of their sexual orientation get inverted and become attracted to being the other sex. And so I guess if I were charted out in terms of causation, it would be that autoheterosexuality is downstream of the autism, and then the gender dysphoria is downstream of the autoheterosexuality. And so, yeah, there's going to be a lot of incels who they have trouble figuring out dating, not because they're ugly or anything like that, but because they just have trouble with social cues because they're on the spectrum and maybe they don't practice enough socializing. But I think that's where the incel to trans pipeline comes from, is just that so many incels have autism spectrum traits, and that they're going to have higher rates of internalized heterosexual attraction. And when they get frustrated at the ability to find a girl, they'll decide to just become one.
Right. So there's a combination of biological, material reality that at the start with the autism, and then you add the social factors in as well, and the difficulties that arise from the autism, and then you end up with this heterosexual result. Is that roughly right?
Yeah, that I think the rate of this internalized attraction is basically the same across generations, but I think the degree to which it gets expressed and the ways that it gets expressed changes depending on cultural and material conditions. And in a modern environment in which a lot of the stigma has been removed around being trans, maybe not perfectly, but like there's been a lot of progress. Um, it's more people with this internalized attraction are going to act on it, and they'll become internally attached to that cross-gender part of themselves, because it's not just about eroticism. There's also attachment because it's part of sexual orientation. So they get kind of like, it's kind of like an internal pair bond, which sounds kind of like abstract and theoretical, but it's in practice, it's sort of like if you develop a habit of wearing women's clothes all the time because of autogynephilia, it can hurt to, like, you get used to it. Like at first it feels good, then you get used to it because of sort of hedonic adaptation. And then at that point, if you were to remove the clothes, you would then feel negative feelings, and that would be dysphoria. And so it's sort of like a progression that's somewhat analogous to the pair bond between people that are married for life, where at first it might be quite erotic, but over time it becomes more about like companionship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, and of course, if you lose them, you feel a tremendous loss when you lose someone you're pair bonded to. So the same thing is true with, I guess, with the removal of the clothes or other signifiers of your feminine nature or masculine nature, if you're
Right. Yeah, if you're like
man.
autoandrophilic, yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about autoandrophilia, and as in comparison to autogynephilia. Is it different? And I know you say it's understudied or maybe not studied much at all. Generally, what I heard was that by far the majority of trans men are lesbian. And when I've encountered trans men in the wild, they tend to be in lesbian relationships, which is always, it's kind of funny. It struck me as funny. But
Are these pre-T or post-T?
T mean testosterone?
Yeah. Sorry for the slang.
Yeah, that's fine. The trans men that I've known personally, and there's really only two, and then I've heard anecdotally about other people's acquaintances. I believe they were post-T
Okay.
and post-mastectomy
Okay.
as well, and they were with. And part of they were in both cases they were in a lesbian relationship, and then one of them decided to become a trans man, and it didn't actually, in either case, do damage or end the relationship.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
Because often it does. And
even
yeah,
in
I
a
will say
lesbian relationship.
right, yeah, like a relationship with a female. Yeah. I will say there is a common perception that most trans men are solely attracted to women, but the demographic data in the large transgender studies, it shows that the majority of them report non-homosexual attractions, which again is either asexuality, bisexuality, or heterosexuality with respect to birth sex. So basically they have some attraction to the other sex, or they're not attracted to anyone. And that would indicate that most trans men are not of the homosexual ideology, which, despite the name of homosexual transsexualism, it's not as simple as the fact that they're just same-sex attracted. It's sort of like a particular developmental pathway that it's also sometimes called early onset gender dysphoria. That's the type that tends to arise in childhood that parents might notice at ages of like 3, 4, or 5. And traditionally, back when society was less accepting, they would be discouraged from their cross-gender behaviors, and most of them would sort of desist from their dysphoria or desire to transition around puberty when they realize like, oh, I'm just gay. But in the modern times, most trans men are not just homosexually attracted. They're attracted to men. And something really interesting that's a recurring pattern I see is that there will be trans men who, before going on testosterone and doing social transition, they date women. And then after they go on testosterone, all of a sudden they start being attracted to men and being curious about that. And eventually some of them realize that their attraction to men is actually truly genuine, and their attraction to women was more about wanting to be masculine in relation. It's sort of that meta attraction I was talking about.
Oh,
And
uh-huh.
and some of them they'll basically start out identifying as lesbian, but then in the end identify as gay men, which is, I imagine, is like quite a mind fuck.
Yeah, um, and I'm going to ask a really technical question, and one that I'm not sure if it serves much of a purpose, but when it comes to genital surgeries, does it tend to be the case that those who get either a neovagina or a penis, an artificial penis, are more likely to be gay transgender people, or does
They're
that
more
change
likely
over
to be,
time?
my read on it is that the vast majority of transsexuals that are pursuing either vaginoplasty or phalloplasty,
Hmm.
they're of the autosexual type. Like, they directly want the cross-gender traits, and the genitals are particularly strong symbolic signifiers of being the other sex. And so it's particularly appealing to them. I think that the homosexual ideology, people with that type of gender dysphoria, they tend not to get surgery as much these days
Oh, okay.
because they don't like directly, like, they would want it to the extent that it helps them find a heterosexual partner of the other sex, right? It's not because like they're directly attracted to having those body parts.
Hmm.
It'd be more of like a pragmatic decision for them. Whereas for the autosexuals, it's something that they deeply, deeply want, and that they can feel disgusted by their body if they don't have, or just, it's sort of, sometimes I talk about gender dysphoria as terms of, it's kind of like a heartbreak feeling, like an unrequited love feeling, you know, uh, like you want to be this thing, but you can never quite make it, quite like fully be the thing. And so there's like this inherent dissatisfaction to that.
Yeah. Um, so why hasn't there been as much research into autoandrophilia as there has been into autogynephilia?
Um, so there's multiple reasons for that. One is that in the old days, back in the 70s, 80s, 60s, like back in the last century, almost all the females that were ending up at gender clinics reported that they were just homosexual attracted, that they're only attracted to women. And the literature reflected that. You know, it said that there's only basically the homosexual type. That's the only genuine type. And I think what happened there is basically that trans men who were trying to get past gatekeepers, they'd read the literature and they'd say like, okay, the type that gets treatment, they say that they're homosexual, so I'm going to say that. I think that's what happened for the most part. And around the 90s, with Lou Sullivan's activism, he was a gay trans man, and he did a lot to spread word about trans men who are attracted to men and feel themselves to be gay men. And after that, the proportion of trans men who said that they were attracted to men increased. And I think, and it has continued to increase. And in the present day, it's most common for trans men to report that they're bisexual. And that just would not have been seen a long time ago. And I think what happened is, at least in Blanchard's clinic, I think he administered some measures of, like, he administered survey items asking about their orientation and whether they'd ever been aroused by cross-dressing. And virtually none of them, I think, reported like endorse those measures of arousal from cross-dressing. And I think part of that is just that autoandrophilic females are less into cross-dressing compared to autogynephilic males. I think for autoandrophilia, it seems more about, I would say autogynephilia would tend to be more about having the body and dressing the part, basically about how it looks visually, because male sexuality is very visually based, and female sexuality is a little more dynamic driven. So I think the autoandrophilic females are more interested in, they care more about others seeing them as men and as behaving in a manly way.
Mhm.
And so I just think the ways that Blanchard asked about it, it wouldn't have really, he wouldn't have been able to identify the autoandrophiles that were in his samples. But yeah, and in addition to this, the situation of like it just not being picked up in the clinic, there's also in 2003 when the trans woman canceled Bailey for writing his book, it made researchers scared of researching anything related to autogynephilia. And that definitely lowers the amount of research. And another thing that makes autoandrophilia not researched is, I mean, I've been trying to convince Bailey of this for a couple of years now, that female autoandrophilia exists, but he's I don't think he's come around yet. But, you know, I originally didn't think it was real because of reading Bailey's work and Anne Lawrence's work. But then I encountered females online who said that they're autoandrophilic, and I interviewed them, and what they said sounded like the female equivalent. And I then went to the literature on female transvestism and transsexualism and looked to see what those people said about their experience that was recorded. And I found cases where there was women who were aroused by cross-dressing and who imagined themselves as male in sexual fantasies. And yeah, basically exactly what you'd expect if autoandrophilia was real. And so, yeah, there's quite a few reasons autoandrophilia is not as well researched at this point. I'm probably the one pushing the hardest for it to be researched because I think it's what's happened. I think most females who pursue gender transition to the point of taking testosterone and getting mastectomies, I think most of them are about autoandrophilic ideology. And I really want clinicians to start being able to understand that and see it so that they can sort of know the condition they're tasked with treating, so they can understand what they're seeing in their office. And also so the autoandrophiles can realize why they want the surgeries and then sort of be extra sure that they're making the right choice either for or against.
When you were on the Gender a Wider Lens podcast, one of the complaints was that you were too rigid in your definitions. And it strikes me that the way we approach sexual orientation now is rather rigid. And I think that comes out of a political struggle that, in order to combat conversion therapy and in order to give homosexuals dignity in the culture, what I would say we had reified orientations as if they're fixed and aren't produced historically or cannot be altered. So the reason I'm saying this is because when you talk about androphilia, one of the things that immediately came to mind would be there was a movie called Henry and June.
I haven't seen that.
In the 90s. And Uma Thurman's in it, and she has a lesbian affair. She's like Henry Miller's lover, and she also has a lesbian affair with Annalise Nin, his Henry Miller's other lover. And there's a scene where she dresses up like a man and is obviously aroused in to come on to Annalise Nin. And there are just lots of examples historically of in both gay and lesbian culture where cross-dressing is a part of the scene, and
Yeah, like the butches
common.
and the femmes in the lesbian scene.
Yeah, right, yeah. So it seems to me like there's a component of androphilia in the lesbian scene already.
Yes.
Uh, you know,
Yeah, the
so
butches. Yeah.
right. So the auto androphilia and lesbianism may not be that cross purposes that much anyway. There may be lesbians who are lesbians because just as much because they like seeing themselves in a masculine position or as men as they are as much as that as they are attracted to women or those things complement each other. There might be a lot of meta
Yeah.
lesbians out there. So, and I don't know. It just seems like that human sexuality is, runs deep. It doesn't just work on one level. It's not just yes or no for most things. And so do you think that, do you agree with me that for instance, some lesbians might be androphilic or
Autoandrophilic.
autoandrophilic in some way?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. That the butches in particular, stone butches, the ones that are just like, I'm going to touch you, you're not going to touch me, that sort of vibe. Those ones I think are especially likely to be autoandrophilic. And of course, this can be contentious, and some lesbians might say it's lesbophobic because sort of they're worried about the implication that they're not authentically attracted to women, that it's just like in service of the male persona. But I think it's not important too much to worry about where the attraction comes from as long as they're treating the people they're in relationships with adequately and both people are consenting and okay with the relationship. I think that's what matters.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. Well, there's a theory that most people are actually bisexual, and then over time they are socialized or adopt one sexual orientation over another. And that doesn't mean that they can be talked out of it or converted, but just that our sexuality isn't necessarily quite so fixed or biologically determined as we might want to think.
I overall think the born this way sort of perspective is correct, particularly for males. Male sexuality seems particularly rigid and not subject to change. And the history of conversion therapy sort of speaks to that at least for males, it's really hard to change. I think with females, there might be a little more wiggle room, but I still lean towards thinking it's mostly just an inborn trait. I mean, since we exist because of natural selection and evolution, the most like evolutionarily viable form of sexual orientation is heterosexuality. And so I personally lean towards thinking that it's not so much about societal conditions as it's mostly inborn traits, although how society exists, the material conditions of our time will influence how we express our sexuality to some degree. But I think the bulk of what's happening is just about the born this way thing.
Yeah. Well, I understand that point of view, and there's no need to debate it. Really, but I would point out that, and my understanding is anyway, and tell me this, maybe this is wrong, but this is what I've read, but in popular magazines, not in any literature really, but that heterosexuality itself began as a term for a disorder when people were overwhelmed by their sexual attraction to the opposite sex, when they allowed that to influence their decision making and dictate how they behaved in life. They were deemed to be heterosexual. And so, like at the beginning of the term, the term at the outset was labeling a disorder, and that a lot of how we think about sexuality has to do with modernity and the kinds of freedom that we have now. So and that we then express as finding our identities, whereas in the past it didn't matter who we were or what we wanted, but rather where we were born, what was our station, what religion were we, what land were we attached to, and things like that. And so our conception of sexuality was entirely different. It wasn't about an individual's desires. It was about the system of life that they were a part of.
Right. It was about reproducing intergenerationally,
Right.
and as for heterosexuality originally being proposed as like a pathology, I have to double check reading. Probably have to read Kraft Ebbing again. I'm assuming that's where that term first arose, or at least it was popularized through Kraft Ebbing's Psychopathia Sexualis. It was like the first sexology textbook.
Mm-hmm.
My hunch is that heterosexuality was not originally pathologized. It was probably seen as like good and normal, but I'd have to double check to be sure. But my hunch is just that, like, I mean, for sure homosexuality was pathologized.
Right.
But I'm not sure about the hetero.
Yeah, well, that's what I read, but we can both check that out. I like to say that. I say that a lot on this podcast. Every once in a while, I'll say that because I don't know. For me, it's some sort of contrarian way of pointing out
it's fun to do
that.
Yeah.
But okay, so let's talk a little bit about how your work has been received by trans people and I guess trans readers, people who just are trans and read it, and then also I guess the trans activist community or the people who are influencers or dominant in like trans media, trans institutions. How have you been received?
I would say for the most part, trans people don't want to talk about the subject. They don't want to touch it with any length of pole. They just don't, they don't want to talk about it. And so for the most part, it hasn't really penetrated into the mainstream of the transgender scene.
They won't touch it with any length of pole, and it hasn't penetrated. Is that what you just told me? Okay.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Well, I'm into sexology, so I'll talk like that. Yeah.
Okay. So go on. What?
They just
not
they
even
don't
enough
wanna
to
talk
be,
about it.
not even enough for people to get angry with you about it, or to
No,
to
because
cancel
to
you
get
or anything?
angry, you have to hear about it or read about it first. Of
Mhm.
course, like there's sort of the issue is for like among people that already know they have the orientation, I have a high approval rating. Like they're glad that there's more people talking about it.
Mhm.
But among the sort of transgender people that are very ideological about their trans identity and tend to skew towards leftism and like luxury gay space communism, so to speak.
Mhm.
They don't, they're not going to seriously investigate whether this is true. They don't care. They care about how how they're treated in society and whether they have access to health care. Like that's mostly what transsexuals care about.
Mhm.
They've already made the decision, so they're not as curious about why they did it. They've already done it.
Mhm.
it so yeah, overall I'd say my work hasn't really gotten much attention among trans people so far, either for or against. Because say like if you're in an online space and you as a trans person say, I found this book interesting because I'm autogynephilic and it helped me make sense of what I was going through. The trans women who feel that their identities are attacked by that theory they're not going to socially accept someone that treats the theory as legitimate. And so and trans people see this and they see that if they were to be honest about autogynephilia or autoandrophilia, that they risk social exclusion among their peers, and that would hurt them emotionally, like severely. And they make the rational decision not to be open about it and not to treat the theory seriously.
Right. And we both have kind of already discussed in this conversation why the theory is threatening to the transgender identity. At least one reason, which is that it risks stigmatizing the transgender experience by associating it with a sexual orientation which is new or newly understood and unusual, and which basically for the same kinds of reasons that homosexuals faced stigma.
Yeah.
And so, but there's that reason, but also there also the additional reason that the autogynephilia itself, it would want to, the people who are autogynephilic are so committed to being the opposite gender and are so attracted to that notion that anything that starts to explain it in terms other than just them being the other gender is uncomfortable, creates dysphoria, is unpleasant.
You're absolutely point on with that. That besides the pragmatic concerns that we previously mentioned, like there's just this inherent, like if you are deeply attached to the idea of being the other sex or gender because you're strongly autogynephilic or autoandrophilic, you're not going to want to hear that your desire, like the reason you feel like you're the other gender is because actually you're not, and that you have an atypical kind of heterosexuality associated with your birth sex, especially because like, at least in terms of queerness, heterosexuality is also not even as queer as they might want. So yeah, there's this sort of inherent opposition to it. And I've seen this regardless, even with the trans species, transabled, trans age, regardless of the type of trans, I've proposed in various online spaces associated with these different groups. I've yet to find any of these forms of trans identity, any of the people with these types of trans identity, that they like hearing what the theory says, even if it's not even about gender, but about something else. Like there's something about being, so it just seems that because the theory, like if the theory is true, right, then people would be deeply attached to their cross gender persona, their trans identity or whatever. And hearing where their feelings come from can feel invalidating and upsetting to them. And it can be upsetting for, pretty much anyone with this type of internalized attraction, even if it's beyond gender.
Yeah, and then you also, I would imagine that trans gender people who are either trans men or trans women would not want to be associated with someone who is a trans species or transabled as well, right?
The optics of it, right? And there's that issue. But then again, in all the communities with these other types of trans identity, the rarer kinds, they have elevated rates of transgenderism as well, which is what you'd expect if the sort of erotic inversion theory is true. Because, if someone has an internalized form of, say, like zoophilia, for instance, and they're attracted to being an animal, that internalization is also likely going to latch onto the gendered aspect of their sexual orientation and make them also internally attracted to being the other sex. So there's elevated rates of transgender identity among all these rarer types of trans identity.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.